A strength a day, be your best every day. Hi, I'm Adimus, founder and director of Strength Optimizer. I aim to help you stay healthy, be happier, and deal with challenges with greater resilience. Have you heard of the term AntiFragile? How can you thrive through disruptions, challenges, and change? Today, you will meet Dr. Paige Williams. Paige will show you how you can thrive through disruption, challenges, and change by applying the 6 guiding principles to becoming anti-fragile. Thank you. Good day, everyone. My name is Adimus. I'm the founder and director of Strength Optimizer. Thank you for watching Strength Optimizer's The Science Up Your Wellbeing series. Today, we have Dr. Paige Williams joining us. Paige is a well-being and leadership expert and honorary fellow of the Center of Positive Psychology at the University of Melbourne and an associate with the Melbourne Business School. Melbourne Business School. Paige has spent more than 20 years in international leadership roles, and she believes that each of us has a capacity for leadership that we have yet to realize. So once again, thank you for joining us, Paige, and how are you doing?
I'm really well, thank you, Adimus, and it's lovely to be with you. Thank you for inviting me here.
No, it's likewise. I know that today we are going to talk about your new book. Ta-da! It is called Becoming Anti-Fragile, Learning to Thrive Through Disruption, Challenge, and Change. But before we unpack your very insightful and practical new book, let's talk about you, Paige. I know that you wear many hats in the well-being field. So, for example, you are a well-being expert, author, speaker, coach, and practitioner, and researcher. But how would you describe yourself, Paige, and what you do?
Well, as you say, it's a bit of all of those, I guess. So, I describe myself as a pracademic. A pracademic. So it brings together the practical real world experience and application that I'm so passionate about, but also with the wonderful new cutting edge understanding and research that's coming out of the academic world. Yeah. And one of the things that I'm particularly personally passionate about is actually building a bridge between those two worlds. So I sometimes describe myself as being bilingual. I think that one of the things that I enjoy, and that I think probably because of that is a superpower for me, is being able to translate those what can be complex and perhaps quite abstract ideas from academia into very practical, applied, real, relatable actions that leaders and teams can take every day in organizations. So pracademic is the way that I describe myself, Adimus.
I like the term, and also like the way you describe it is like not only a set of wonderful skills that you have, but also more like a superpower to be able to bridge the gap between the academia and the real life practical applications. Yeah. Because I guess that for a lot of people, especially just making assumptions here for the general public, sometimes it can be quite daunting going through some sort of academic textbooks, but somehow you just have the wonderful ability to synthesize the cutting edge research into something that's very relatable and palatable and practical for the general public and the community. So well done on the new book once again.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Paige. So we know that the word well-being is used in many ways and many forms in different contexts. So for you, what is well-being and why it matters?
So, that's such a big question, isn't it? What is well-being? Well, I think the first thing is that whilst we have some general understandings of what contributes to well-being, the first thing that we need to accept is that it's very personalized. So what well-being looks like for me would not be the same as it is for you, for example, Adimus. And whilst any model or framework that we have for well-being is useful as a scaffold, they're only ever descriptive, not prescriptive, right? Okay. So they only ever help us understand more. They don't tell us what it looks like for us. All right. So I think the first thing is that whilst we can very broadly describe well-being as feeling well and doing well, and in my work I add on to that leading well. So for me, that's what well-being is. Well-being is feeling well, doing well, and leading well. And that's not specifically because I work with leaders and senior leadership teams, it's because we need to lead ourselves well.
Yeah.
And that actually feeling well and doing well enables us and asks us to lead ourselves well, because it's some of the work that we have to engage with, and it's not always easy in terms of us creating and developing our well-being, means that we are engaging in self-leadership.
Yeah.
We're actually kind of looking in the mirror and maybe seeing that the way that we are thinking about ourselves, the way that we're living our lives isn't what's taking us towards our best selves and our best lives. And, it takes engaging self-leadership to go, do you know what? That's not okay. And I'm going to do something about that and be intentional about how I go about changing that.
Yeah.
So I think that's what well-being is. And why does it matter? Oh, why does it matter? Well, anyone, and I'm sure everyone, I know I have, anyone who's been on the other side of that feeling well, doing well, leading well kind of coin, not feeling well, not doing well, not leading well, that's not a great space to be in life. And whilst it's understandable that we'll all be there at some point, if that goes on for too long, that can be hugely debilitating. And so again, this is where the passion and the purpose comes in the work that I do, is helping people understand that there are intentional choices and actions that they can take to move them beyond that, to make sure that whilst those times may be inevitable, they can be less frequent and they can be less potent, less strong. And you can, even as you experience them, know that you will come through them okay, and that you have tools on your leadership and well-being tool belt to help you do exactly that.
Very well said. And I totally agree with what you said in terms of our well-being is personal. It can be quite subjective. And also it is actually descriptive rather than prescriptive. Because sometimes I guess that when we look into well-being, we just say, oh, that is a specific well-being frameworks or theories that is applicable. That means that if I'm not able to follow that specific frameworks or theory, that means I'm not good enough. I fail myself. So I guess that liberating to know that, hey, these are the descriptive frameworks, but it's not one size fits all, I guess, at the end of the day. Yeah.
Models are really useful, but they're useful as a framework for our thinking, as a framework for our reflection. If we start using them as a almost a kind of a something hard for us to kind of target ourselves against, that's when they stop being useful. So the models themselves are useful. It's the way that we use them that can stop them being so. Yeah.
And the way I'm hearing it is that you actually incorporate leading ourselves as also part of components of well-being, which is so true. Because a lot of time when you hear the word leaders or leadership, immediately we're thinking about, oh, we need to have 100, 1,000 of followers, you say. But at the end of the day, if we can lead ourselves as an example, and we know that they will have a lot of ripple effects, contagion effects, especially when it comes to the well-being ripple effects. So that is so true that we got to be accountable to ourselves as much as we are living also within the context or the system too.
That's right. The self-leadership piece is where it begins, because we then role model behaviors and mindsets and attitudes, and we then have energy that we share with others that helps them perhaps see another way of being, another way of showing up. And so the self-leadership for me is the start point.
That's great. Let's talk about your new book, Becoming AntiFragile. I mean, personally, I'm very intrigued with the title, Becoming AntiFragile. So I'm just wondering, what is the significance of the title then, Paige?
Yeah, thanks, Adimus. So AntiFragile is a term that was developed by a writer in the economic and kind of political science field, a writer called Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And he coined the phrase in relation to economic systems that actually come through disruption and chaos in economic terms better. So they actually improve as they kind of ride the ups and downs of, the stock markets. Yeah. So some companies and some organizations, their stock actually improves as the market more generally goes through a pretty tumultuous time. So that's where the term anti-fragile came from. And I first read about it in Mark Manson's book about hope. And for me, it kind of set off this lots of fireworks in my brain around, wow, well, okay, so if that's what it means for economic systems and that's what it means for political systems, this is a principle that we can apply to human systems.
Yeah.
Whether that's a system of one, or whether it's a team of 10, or whether it's a whole organization, you know, we can apply this idea of this concept of anti-fragile.
Yeah.
And the thing that particularly appealed to me about it was it's what for me lies the other side of resilience.
Okay.
It's kind of what's over the resilience rainbow. Well, it's anti-fragile, because I've taught resilience for a long time. It's such a core topic within positive psychology and well-being. And there's lots of great evidence around what are the protective factors, what help us be resilient. You know, the wonderful work that was done initially with children and that now has expanded out to look at, you know, different stages of life development, how we can be resilient. But for me, the thing that always I questioned around resilience was that, you know, we use the metaphor of a tennis ball being able to bounce back.
Yeah.
But at that point, we're only ever staying where we are. We're standing on the spot and jumping up and down, and we're using lots of energy, but we're not actually getting anywhere. And so as I read about anti-fragile is something whereby as we go to that effort, we actually are moving forward in some way. We are taking the learning from our experience, from the experience of disruption, of challenge, of uncertainty, of change. And rather than just kind of bouncing up and down with that experience, we are intentionally and constructively looking at the experience to see what learning we can take from it. How can we learn forward and be better coming out of this experience than we were going into it? So with the essence, anti-fragile is something that actually improves through the experience of perhaps struggle and challenge and change, rather than just either responding to it and bouncing back.
So Paige, earlier on you talk about the differences between resilience and anti-fragile, and I guess that most of the people will be familiar with the concept or the understanding of resilience. But then it's so wonderful for you to say that actually when we become resilient, as good as it is, we are bouncing back but still on the same spot over and over again, which can consume a lot of energy. Whereas with anti-fragile, it's actually bounce forward, asking the questions, what can we learn through a very difficult circumstances, whether it's through disruption, change, and challenge. Would that be a fair summary over there, Paige?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the central question, the central thesis, if you like, to becoming anti-fragile is, how can we be better? How can we be better from this experience than we were coming into it? Now, the lovely thing about that is we get to choose what better looks like.
Yeah.
Better doesn't necessarily mean more. Better could quite possibly mean less.
Okay.
Better could quite possibly mean a focus on relationships over work. It could quite possibly mean engaging in mindfulness practice. So we get to choose what better looks like. And I think that's a really important question to hold is what meaningfully does better look like for us from this experience? And I think, you know, as I speak to leaders and teams coming out of a COVID impacted year, perhaps their understanding of what better looks like has actually really been challenged, and they're coming out with a different understanding of better from what's happened with them in 2020.
Yeah, and I guess that one immediate example that I can think of is that for a lot of leaders pre-COVID, better means that everyone's come to office space to work. But now, during COVID, better means that giving people the flexibility and the resources to actually work from home. I guess that the misconceptions will be like when or if people work from homes, they could be less productive, they could be that they wouldn't be actually focusing on their work. But I guess that from the initial research I'm reading, it's actually the other way around. So maybe there's another way of what better means during the COVID period.
Absolutely. And the thing that, again, one of the implicit it's not an assumption, but one of the implicit understandings in becoming anti-fragile is that thriving and struggle can go hand in hand. So even as we experience the struggle, the beautiful work of Adam Fraser speaks to this, Dr. Adam Fraser, his idea around striving, that actually even as we engage in the struggle, we can be thriving, we can kind of strive. And this is really, the anti-fragile speaks to this, because it's, even as you may be feeling a level of discomfort, it's understanding that the experience will help you in some way learn something and gain in some way so that you are better coming out of that experience. So this idea of well-being not being something that happens in isolation from struggle, but that often the things that bring out the best in us, the things that have most meaning for us, are those moments and experiences that force us to dig deep. And they're the ones that often do involve struggle.
Okay. I'm sure that you will explain a little bit more in your book again later. But I guess that actually talking about how can we be better coming up from a very challenging kind of experience immediately, again, based on my work with different people. Sometimes people may say that, look, I have nothing left. I just do not know how to take another steps. The stress level, the pressures are just becoming overwhelming. So what suggestion, advice that you have for leaders or for people who are saying that, look, I do not know how to be better. It's just too overwhelming then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure that many of us have felt like this at times this year. I know I have. And certainly, just because I've written a book and developed principles around to become anti-fragile, part of our human experience is to feel fragile at times. So one of the things I want to make really clear is that becoming anti-fragile is a journey, and that's the metaphor I use in the book. And it's a journey that never ends, because as we have different experiences, we learn from them, we learn forward, but then our context changes, and that's constantly changing. So it's not like we always get the same flavor or the same scale or type of challenge. And so whilst we might have learned from one experience to help us deal with what's coming up, it will never be exactly the same. But also a couple of things around that. So one is that being anti-fragile doesn't mean we'll never be fragile. And actually it's very natural for us at times to feel like we just can't cope with what's being asked of us. And that's what fragile means. I describe and define our levels of kind of fragility or robustness or anti-fragility as being how big or small is the gap between our confidence and our motivation and our sense of support as we deal with the level of complexity and challenge and uncertainty in our environment. So if we've got a big gap between those two things, between confidence, motivation and support, and the level of disruption and change, then we're going to feel fragile. But if that gap is smaller, then that's when we're going to feel anti-fragile. And perhaps, if we feel that we're more than capable of coping with it, that's when we actually get to that point where we can thrive, even if we're dealing with the disruption. So what I would say is, one, don't deny those feelings. It's absolutely okay and natural to feel like that. The second thing I would say is that the irony in this is that we often make ourselves fragile. And in the book, I talk about 3 gaps that I call the fragility gaps. And they are, one is the expectation that we have of the way the world and ourselves should be, and the reality that we are experiencing. And again, if there's a big gap between what we think should be happening and what we're experiencing, then that can be a whole big gap of suffering, and that can make us fragile. The second is between feelings of safety and risk. And if we're wanting to stay safe all the time and we're not prepared to take risk, then that can make us fragile in a world where there is complexity and change going on, because we're wanting to stay safe, we're wanting to play small. And that's, again, when we think about, is that realistic? It's not. It makes us fragile. And then the third gap in terms of our fragility gap is around our safety risk expectations, reality, and stability and disruption. Okay. So it's unrealistic for us to think that we're going to be able to keep things stable and we're going to be able to control everything in our environment, given what's going on, in 2020, but beyond that. We had these big dynamics going on even before COVID hit. So if we've got this need to feel stable and certain and in control, again, that's going to make us fragile, because the reality is our world is not like that.
Yeah.
So if we can, as leaders, identify, well, am I actually keeping myself or making myself fragile? And as we feel fragile, if we can actually kind of have a look at that in a almost detached way and go, okay, so what's going on for me right now? Are these one of these gaps that are particularly big for me right now? And how can I close that in some way to help myself feel more comfortable with what's going on?
Yeah. Thank you so much for explaining that so well. And also to clarify for us that it is natural, it's human, to go through that, if I may use the word suffering, the pain. So in one hand, giving us the permission to be real and to be raw, but on the other hand, to give us some practical toolbox of understanding to look at what kind of gaps that I'm actually in at the moment. And obviously, if the gap is getting bigger and bigger, that's where we feel a lot more fragile or even more vulnerable. So it's about narrowing the gaps, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
And that's the first steps. The first thing we can do really practically is very honestly with ourselves, have a look at, how am I making myself fragile?
Yeah.
What is it that I'm doing that actually is keeping me fragile? Because the other piece about, we think about permission to be human. It's, permission to be human means that, yes, we're not always going to feel okay with everything that's going on, but also understand that we are actually built to withstand a certain level of stress. In fact, if we have an environment that is too stable and too predictive and doesn't give us enough challenge to kind of push up against, then we do not thrive. In fact, we kind of flatline. And I know I've had times in my life when I felt this, when everything's kind of felt a bit meh and beige, and that doesn't bring out the best in us either. So complex adaptive systems, such as human beings, we need challenge. We need to be stressed to a certain extent in order to learn and grow and thrive.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes so irony in the sense that as human beings, our natural tendency is to run away from pain, run away from challenges, but yet we know that we need almost a kind of resistance to help us to grow. It's almost like going to a gym. We want to build up our muscles or endurance. Pain is key. Pain is necessary. And then from then on, we build greater and greater level of endurance and therefore become stronger and better.
Absolutely. And more intelligent in terms of, our experiences and what we can learn from them. So yeah, permission to be human in its fullest extent, both the suffering and the opportunity that comes from that.
Yeah, brilliant. So when it comes to some practical insight that you offer in your book, so in a nutshell, how can leaders thrive through a time of disruption, change, and challenge, Paige?
Wow, that's such a huge question, so big that I wrote a whole book about it. So I'll just dive into a couple of things that I found that leaders certainly this year have found particularly useful. So in the book, I start off by introducing 6 principles that I call the robust principles. And I use the acronym because our brains love acronyms, because a bit like models, right? They help us have a framework for us to hang our thinking around. Now, as I introduce each of those, they move through neuroscience and positive psychology and leadership and social psychology and social neuroscience. And one of the things that I start with as the foundation, the R of the robust principles, is recruit the brain. And I feel like if we can understand the way our brains are wired, and rather than fighting our physiology, actually work with it, then, it's really going to help us take steps towards becoming anti-fragile.
Yeah.
One of the things that we know our brain likes, as you say, is to keep us safe. Okay, its overarching guiding principle is survival. So safety is absolutely a key part of that. And one way that we do that is by being able to predict the near future. So we like that idea of certainty and control that I've already spoken about. Now, this year in 2020, wow, let me tell you, has that button been challenged in our brains, particularly for leaders, as they have, had organizations and their teams turning to them and say, well, what now? What next? What are we going to do? And they haven't got the answers because everything is changing so quickly, particularly in a COVID impacted world. And as I've worked with leaders and with teams, it's been really useful for them to identify what they can control, what they can't control, what they can influence, and then based on that, what constructive action can they take? So the questions as they kind of face this, if you like, tsunami of uncertainty is, okay, in this situation, what can I control? What can't I control? And therefore, what do I need to let go of? What can I take off of the table because I can't control that? And then what can I influence? Now, these are the things that maybe I can't actually really clearly say it's going to go that way, but I can try and have a voice in influencing that in some way. And then as I look across that whole picture of can't control, can control, influence, how can I make good choices about where I place my energy and my attention and my focus and be most constructive and effective in doing that? So what action do I take moving forward? So that's just one way that we can kind of not be overwhelmed by what's going on and actually be anti-fragile, because one of the core pieces of anti-fragile is that we move to action. We don't just stay in this paralyzed state. And it helps us understand how we can do that in the most effective way.
Yeah. So I know in a very layman term, for me, almost as a leader, sometimes again have to decide which battle that I want to engage into fighting in terms of the resources, especially, I guess once again, I'm guilty of that as well. I want to have lots of control, especially in the places where there's a lot of uncertainty. So it's always good to take a step back to say that, yes, I only have limited resources, but there's a tsunami of challenges. So to take a step back to assess the situation, to assess ourselves and lead ourselves well in that very uncertain environment.
And it can be a great way for them to have a coaching conversation with their team members as well. So often, one of the things that happens as people start to try and grapple with uncertainty is there'll be a constant stream of team members into the leader's office or space wanting to kind of go, and what about this, and what about that, and what about this? And so rather than kind of taking that on, to use these questions as coaching questions. Okay, so Adimas, you're my team member. Adimas, what's out of your control in this situation? And actually then, rather than the prehistoric brain for staying in an emotive state, which is us going, oh, what about this? What about this? I'm actually asking you to rationalize and analyze what is it you can't control. And we have that conversation. Okay, so what can you control? And we have that conversation. What can you influence? Is there anything you can influence? We have that conversation. Then I ask you, okay, so let's have a look at all of this. So what does it look like for you to take constructive step forward now? And by coaching you in that conversation, you have complete commitment and accountability to the actions that we get to at the end of that conversation. Yeah. All I've done is provided the guiding rails and the prompts for you to kind of get out of your own way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. The other way I can think about it is you're giving me or the coachee a sense of agency, a sense of autonomy, a sense of making effective choices. So that I know that, yes, this is the level of influence that I can do. If I know that I have a sense of agency, I'm going to be more motivated. I'm going to be more committed. And then I'm going to be more likely to achieve the goal, so to speak.
Absolutely. And what we're doing is handing the accountability back and the responsibility back. We're not trying to spoon feed. We're saying, hang on, I can help you find the answers, but I'm not going to give you the answers.
Yeah. Brilliant, brilliant. So at a more personal level, Paige, what is the most surprising thing that you have learned or discovered about yourself while writing the book, Becoming AntiFragile?
Well, I have to say that writing a book in itself was an exercise in anti-fragility, because writing is not something that comes particularly naturally to me.
All right.
And so actually just having the discipline to sit down and kind of sit with the struggle, if you like, of and wanting to get the work out into the world. But also, so around book launch time, which was in July, we did a book launch that actually fell completely flat. There were technical issues with Amazon, and we had to absolutely abandon the whole thing at about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. And so we'd had about 6 weeks run into this. And, you know, off the back of writing the book and getting it published very quickly and then moving into this pre-launch program. So then for it to really fall apart on the day was heartbreaking. And, you know, at that moment and on that day, as much as I kind of brushed myself off and did some communications around it, I was fragile. I could have just crawled under the doona and kind of stayed there for a few weeks. And so what was interesting was that I had to kind of take a spoon of my own medicine, and I had to reach out to other people. I had to reframe the way I was thinking about the day and the events of the day. And whilst after a little bit of time has passed, I was able to go back and go, okay, what learning am I taking forward from this? So I think, you know, what's been most surprising for me, but reassuring, is one, the principles really do work, because I've had to apply them in real time. On yourself. It worked. So that was great and reassuring. And secondly, that, you know, no matter how often you walk this stuff or you talk this stuff, there's still more to learn, because what that really showed me is you never know what's around the corner and what anti-fragility it's going to ask of you. And so really, it really brought home that this just is an ongoing journey, and enjoy the ride. Don't expect ever to get to the end of it. Enjoy the process.
Thank you so much, you know, for that very raw, real of your personal sharing when it comes to the book launch. One last question for you. What is one thing that you have been doing this week to look after your own well-being?
Okay, so let's see, this week, what have I been doing? So actually this week, what I've been doing is resting. So I'm normally someone who does lots of physical activity. I love, we have a group exercise thing over here called F45, and I like to do yoga, but I tore a muscle in my calf a few weeks ago. And so not a very bad tear. And so what I've had to do, and I talk about this in the book as well, is I've had to not do. I've had to actually not train, and I've had to not do a lot of yoga, and I've had to just rest. And this is, you know, this is hard for me. This is a struggle for me, but I also know it's the thing I need to do to look after my well-being in the long term. And so we talk about that in the robust principles about non-interventionism, and how sometimes not taking action is the most powerful thing to do. And so that's what I've been doing this week.
Very beautiful to say. And it is so true. I guess that, you know, many people somehow has the compulsions to perform, to run, to do things, to be productive at the expense of taking it, slowing things down and resting. And we know that, again, from a psychological and physiological point of view, resting is as powerful as doing, especially when it's actually very much necessary. So again, thank you for sharing about your well-being tips. So Paige, really appreciate you spending some time with us today. And obviously, if you want to engage Paige speaking, mentoring, and training in leadership and well-being science, make sure you visit her website at drpaigewilliams.com. I repeat that again, it's drpaigewilliams.com. And of course, remember to grab a copy of her new book, Becoming AntiFragile, and learn all the robust principles in these books as well. So thank you for joining me, Paige.
Thank you so much, Ademus. It's been a real joy talking with you this afternoon.
Likewise. And once again, thank you for watching. My name is Dimas from Strength Optimizer. We are here to bring out the best in you through optimizing your strengths. Have a fabulous day, everyone. Ciao and goodbye.